So
unless you're Rachel, she can have like 2 or 3 in each hand.
yeah,
She has to be up there.
different personalities or interesting. Okay. See. Well, here we are, gathered together in this place. And we gather in hope. We gather to sing, to be blessed by music. We gather to pray. We gather to come to the table. And we also gather to hear what God is saying to us here today. And we do this, I hope, and I believe, because we trust that God is still speaking. The God of the Bible, the God of our faith ancestors, is still speaking to us and to the people of faith. God is speaking to us, I believe, from our sacred texts, the stories of Moses and Abram and Sarah, the story of Jesus and the disciples, the story of Paul, the story of the prophets. We believe that God is speaking to us in the Spirit that moves in us and among us and between us. God is speaking to us in our circumstances and through our circumstances. And God is speaking to us through the lives of our neighbors. But even though our God seems to be a talkative God in a way, it is challenging at times to hear what God is saying, to understand what God is saying with all the noise and light and movement and distractions of our lives. So to help us hear what God might be saying to us here today, we might need some assistance. So we look at others and their lives and their stories to see what God was saying to them, doing in their lives, so that we can then look and see what God is doing in ours. And so today we join Moses and the Israelites, where we've been for the past Sunday or two. But let's locate them so then we can then locate ourselves. They are no longer in Egypt. They are also not yet in the promised land. So they're not here, Egypt, not in the promised land, which means they are where? In the wilderness. That's right. They are in the desert, and they are wandering. They have a rough idea of where they're going from day to day. If we remember the text, they had a pillar of fire at night and a pillar of smoke during the day. But they didn't have a map. They didn't know where they were going. So they were wandering, but they were still alive and still hopeful, right? They had just been brought out of slavery, so they had hope in their hearts, but they were wandering, and they were probably footsore and hungry. And it's important to note that it wasn't just a few of them. So biblical scholars disagree, but they believe that the number of Israelites that came out of captivity was not 20 or 200, that it's somewhere in the realm between 50,000 and 2 million. Right. Not a small group of people. I mean, imagine that. Imagine it. Imagine the chaos. All right, so roughly between folks joining us online and us gathered here today, there's probably 60, I think Bob was just counting, maybe 60 people. What if we all immediately stood up and went for a hike? We went to like Cougar Mountain or something, somewhere. We went on a hike together, just as we are. Think about what a mess that would be. Think about how many marriages would be strained and how many friendships tested. And even though we're a small group, we'd be stretched out for miles, right? And people would be moving at different paces. There'd be a few people who are like our hiker people, and they'd be like leading the way, and come on, let's go. And there'd be people just kind of mosey and sightseeing, and then there'd be people in the back who are just like trying to keep up. Now add to our hike that we don't know when it's going to end. We're not just doing a loop of a mile or two. We're just heading out into the wilderness. And we're just walking. And we don't have all the REI gear. We don't have Gore-Tex boots and Patagonia fleecy jackets and all of that. We've just got what we're wearing today. And we're just walking. We're hopeful. We're probably footsore right away, hungry, worried. Add to that the fact that most of us are not professional outdoor adventurers, nor were the Israelites. They were not avid hikers or campers. They were children and workers and grandmothers and grandfathers and uncles of all different capacities. I think it's safe to say, like us, if we just went out for a walk, a hike, and just kept walking, that it would not take long for them to be very, very uncomfortable with who they were, what they were experiencing, uncomfortable with their surroundings. There was nothing in the wilderness experience that they were prepared for. Because they were, in truth, in reality, they were not outdoor adventurers, they weren't desert wanderers, they were liberated slaves. Think about that for a moment. Whereas 1 week they were enslaved in Egypt. And then a month or a week later, not long after that, they were in the wilderness. Now, these were people who had not been taken into slavery. I about said enjoyed it, but I don't think they enjoyed it. Experienced it, that's the word I'm looking for a couple years, and then came out of slavery. They were in slavery for 400 years. There was not a single one of them who remembered what it was like to not be a slave. They had been enslaved for generations. And like all slaves, they had been told what to do and what not to do, where to go and where not to go. This is who is in the wilderness. So when we get to some of the passages of Exodus where we hear grumbling, and sometimes I think we're pretty quick to criticize, like, oh, they had so little faith. Of course God would provide for them, but I challenge that if we were to be in similar circumstances, we would be just as grumbly as they were. We would be just as afraid. We would be just as anxiety-filled. But enter into that Moses. And be aware that Moses plays a really specific role here. And it's much more than his role in getting the Israelites out of Egypt. Like, obviously, that's on one of his greatest hits. Like, that's a big deal. But his role is more than just liberator. Because once he brings them out of Egypt, he's the one who is leading them through the wilderness. And he's doing this by providing them laws and structure. And so just imagine for a minute, say we go with the low estimate of like 50,000 people. What would it be like if they didn't have somebody saying, this is what you can do and this is what you cannot do? What would it be like to have 50,000 people out in the wilderness just trying to figure it out? It would be absolute chaos. It would not be long before the strongest rose up and took away from the weakest. There would be groups of people who were saying we need to go back, because we know that part of the story. There would be groups of people saying we need to go that way. Some people are saying we need to go that way. It would be absolute chaos. And so the very first part in our reading today, our Old Testament reading, is the very first of the laws that is provided to them to help them live in the wilderness. And God seemed to understand that this group was a group of liberated slaves. They weren't adventurers. They had never known anything other than enslavement. So they needed some help to turn from a group of liberated slaves into a group of something else. They needed some help to be a new kind of people together, a new kind of community. They were experiencing nothing less than the renewal of their identity. And so the question is why? Like, why did they need Moses? Why did they need the wilderness? Surely in God's goodness, God's power, God could have said, here's your place of enslavement, here's your place of freedom, and it's about a nice half-a-mile walk. Why was it necessary? Why was the wilderness necessary? That's the central question. And I think it's this. I think it's because what worked for survival in Egypt doesn't work in the wilderness. And as we discover, what works in the wilderness doesn't work in the promised land. Does that make sense? So Moses, along with being the liberator and lawgiver, is also the embodiment of a new way of being, a new way of thinking that we can kind of say is like no longer slaves. That's their title. And them no longer being slaves required a new kind of thinking for them, a new way of thinking about themselves, a new way of ordering themselves, their relationships, their understanding of who God is and who they are. And this is what Moses was helping them do. This is what the wilderness was helping them do. So here's an example, like a modern example, to help us understand this. So 90% of the people who either inherit large sums of money or win the lottery within a few years are back to their previous wealth level. Why? Why is that?
Old habits.
There you go. Old habits, old patterns. Not updating their thinking to fit their new circumstances. So Rachel and I have some friends, and they're lovely people. They're close friends, but the wife, who I'm really hoping is not on Zoom right now, don't think she is, because she didn't come to church when we lived in the same town, so I'm pretty sure she's not here. Lovely person, by the way, but she was raised fairly wealthy, pretty darn well off. In her married life, they are not wealthy. And she is perpetually frustrated and almost perpetually dissatisfied with her life because they're not rich. And rather than adjust her thinking to a new reality, she sort of stays permanently disappointed. And I bet you know folks who fit into some of these categories. Something has changed, and yet their thinking hasn't changed, and it makes them angry. It makes them anxiety-ridden. It makes them despondent. For the Israelites, the wilderness time was necessary for their growth so that they could leave the shackles behind, but the shackles they were really leaving behind weren't the physical ones. That was quick. That was easy. The shackles they were leaving behind were the mental ones, the emotional ones, the spiritual ones, the way of thinking as a slave. The wilderness was intentionally long. That's what 40 years means, by the way. Anytime you have a number like that in the Bible, it's not literal. It means a good long time. So if it means long enough for something to happen. So when Jesus heads out into the desert during his own time for 40 days and nights, was it actual 40 days and nights? Probably not. But it was long enough for what to happen? For something to happen, right? I mean, that's what 40 is a code for. So anytime you hear 40 or a number like that, it's code. And that's what was happening with the Israelites in the wilderness. They were out there so that they could learn that it wasn't going to kill them to leave the routine and familiarity of where they were. And in fact, it would kill them to stay there. All of this points to what God is helping them with. Because really the story of Exodus is the story of God's help. And God is helping them to live into the fact that new circumstances require a new way of thinking. In essence, God is asking God's self, what do they need right now so that they can be alive? Like really alive. And then God offers. If they need a guide to come out of slavery so that they can be really alive and not captive, then God offers it. If they need a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day so that they can keep moving forward and not stagnate, then God offers it. When they hit to a place where they are hungry and doubting or thirsty and doubting, they need sustenance, they need water, then God offers it. This, in a really cool way, is the same question, the question that God was asking God's self, I think, about what do they need now so that they can be alive, is kind of the same unspoken question that Jesus is asking the Pharisees in our New Testament text. So the Pharisees ask him their kind of trap as a question. They're trying to trick him, trying to trap him. And Jesus answers in a way that challenges them, because he recognized that for them to be alive, they needed some new understandings. So there's an interesting thing at play here, jumping back to Moses. We've established that what worked in Egypt, a way of life, a way of thinking, how to survive in Egypt, doesn't work in the wilderness. But the next piece is also true. That the way of life, the way of thinking, the way of surviving in the wilderness doesn't work when they get to the promised land. And that's why who doesn't get to go into the promised land? Moses. Because Moses is the embodiment of that way of life, that way of thinking, and it's absolutely crucial for a time for them. It's why they survive, but it reinforces that message that different circumstances require different thinking. New days require some new ways. But notice that I included the word some in there. New days require some new ways. As the Israelites wandered in the wilderness, they carried with them some important things. They carried with them the heart of who they were. They didn't take houses, right? They didn't take possessions. Anyone who's gone on a backpacking trip knows you have about 40 pounds worth of stuff you can carry. And after that, it's too much. And you find yourself just shedding stuff as quickly as you can. But you take the core, the rituals, the relationships, the things that truly matter, the heritage. So hopefully I'm not being too subtle. No? Okay, good. Because we're in new days, aren't we? We're in a bit of a wilderness. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if somebody had said, these congregations that you've been a part of for most of you at least a long time, well, they're going to look desperately different in a few years. And, oh, by the way, we're going to go through a worldwide pandemic that's going to mean you actually don't leave your house and don't attend church in person for 2+ years. Like, if somebody had said that's what's coming, you would have been like, ridiculous, absurd. And yet that's precisely where we find ourselves. We are in a wilderness, and the temptation when we're in the wilderness is strong. It's strong to want to go back. For all of us, myself included. Myself included. But our sacred story teaches us, not just once, but again and again, that the wilderness is important and that you can't rush it, and that it can be a true gift. It can be the greatest gift if it helps us to change of heart and change our minds. And so in the middle of this story about a people in a wilderness, I want you to hear the good news, O people of God. Like our spiritual ancestors, God is calling us to aliveness, even as we wander, even as we are transformed and asked to transform for the gospel, for our neighbors, and yes, even for ourselves. God is still calling. God is still speaking. God is still guiding. God is still offering us food for this sacred journey of aliveness. And so join me in prayer, if you would. O Lord of life, Lord of light, it is not just here in church that we often look up and find ourselves in a wilderness. We, time and time again, find ourselves in places and phases of life where things are unfamiliar. We find ourselves widowed, or in a different community, or losing a job, or being pulled away from something that has been so very much a part of our lives and who we are. And it is exhausting, and it is terrifying, and it's hard to get excited about being in the wilderness. And that's why we need you. And we need guides like Moses, like our sacred stories, like the hymns we sing that remind us that we are yours, and that you come to us in the silence, and that you accompany us through our own deserts. And so help us as a people of faith to just take the next step in faith. Help us as individuals when we encounter those places in our life where little looks familiar to be willing to keep learning and to keep growing. We trust that you are still speaking, O Lord, and so give us ears to hear, we pray. Amen. Here, and I thought I was being subtle with this message, but apparently not.